Welcome to Inside Audit, IIA Belgium's podcast. In 2021, the IIA started with research and benchmarking as input for the revision of the IPPF. 3 years, countless working groups, 1,600 completed surveys, 19,000 specific comments, and 120 pages later, we have reached one of the most important milestones of the profession in the past decades. Since January the 9th, the global internal audit standards are published, and they will become effective 12 months later. Because of the significance of this milestone, we will dedicate 5 episodes of this podcast, one for each domain of the standards, with our 3 distinguished guests. We have the same guests as in our first episode, so once again, Kathleen, John and Nicolas, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to this second episode around the internal audit standards around ethics and professionalism, domain 2. Ethics and professionalism are the cornerstone of our profession, ensuring that internal auditors act in a manner that's respectful, fair, and responsible towards others. By adhering to the ethical standards and professional conduct, we set a foundation for excellence, innovation, and sustainable success. So a very, very important domain for internal audit. Kathleen, new in this area is the concept of professional courage. What does that mean?
Well, it looks like we are kicking off with the most difficult one here, because I think that there's probably no straightforward answer to that. And as you may have seen, this is a term or a concept that is also not explained in the glossary. In the glossary, you will find all the terms that really relate to our profession, that are very specific for our profession, or the more general ones, which have then also a specific, let's say, perspective or interpretation for our profession. And the Standards Board had the impression that professional courage is not something that is typically for internal audit. Of course, internal auditors should be professionally courageous. But on the other hand, I believe that it's the role of everybody within our organization to have the courage to stand up for whatever you want to say. And when it comes to the meaning, Cedric, I think it's pretty clear that everybody understands that professional courage or courage is all about doing the right thing, saying the right thing, even when it becomes difficult. So for internal auditors, it's delivering your work, but also addressing the difficult decisions or the difficult discussions with your board, with your senior management, even if this might jeopardize your personal situation or your job even. So I think that this is probably the one where it will be more difficult or challenging to bridge the theoretical concept into the practice, I guess.
Perfect bridge to my next question, because the theory is clear. But Nicola, how do you think we will measure and monitor professional courage?
I will quote Kathleen, that's not an easy one. When I saw this concept, this new concept, I was surprised, but pleased at the same time. But then the question was, what does it mean? And then how indeed are we going to monitor that? Because it's new, I'm still thinking about it. My gut feeling for now is that it's something that will be difficult to quantify, meaning I will have a KPI about that, I will have a monitoring about that, I will have statistics. Maybe. At present, I don't know. I see it more in a qualitative way to measure and monitor that, and I'll give you a few examples. It can be through ex post feedback. So after engagement, you could have talks with the team, with the business, with the chief audit executive. And have you shown courage? Or maybe in that instance, you should have, and you haven't. You can have satisfaction surveys, peer reviews, where you have discussion with the whole function if you can. It can be through mentorship as well. You have a junior position, you have a more senior mentor, and you discuss those aspects which are also a bit tricky and sensitive. And then maybe I will give a few examples when I think about my career, because I've been in a situation where I had to show, or maybe not show, professional courage. And I can think of 2 right now. One was I was in disagreement with a senior auditor. So I was on the team. I was the junior one years ago, and we were not in agreement. And so I stood my ground. And in the end, we ended up in the office of the chief audit executive. I could have back down. I could have said, okay, you're the senior and I agree with you. In the end, neither of us was right, in the sense that the chief audit executive very, very diplomatically find a kind of consensus between the 2 positions. So that's one example. Another one that comes to mind, I was with the business where I was performing an audit. I was requesting some information and I wasn't receiving what I wanted. And I kept asking, they said, no, you can't have that, which was an issue because We're supposed to have access to everything. And then again, it went back up to the top management of that department and the top management of my top management, which is the chief audit executive. And afterwards, I learned why they didn't want to share the information. There were good reasons for that. But I'm happy that at that time, I pressed on the issue and I kept on asking, and it escalated to the head of internal audit. And yeah, it could have jeopardized my position of my career, but in the end, it did not. On the contrary, I think it showed to my N+1 and my N+2 that, okay, Nicolas is someone that can stand his ground in difficult situation. Yes, he's still young, he has to learn, but at least he has some guts. So to come back to the question, not an easy one, and I would start monitoring that in a qualitative way. And the future will see if we can have something more quantitative, more structured.
Thank you, Nicolas, for sharing those examples as well. John, what other pressure can there be on internal auditors, and how should they cope with that, in your opinion?
First, let me say that I'm extremely happy with this new standard, because I think it's really important to have courage, and it also many times makes a difference in being effective or not. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. At Nijrode University in the Netherlands, Professor Kat Seeuws did a research on request of the IIA, looking at what enables and disables moral courage. And one of the disablers is, of course, the pressure and the pushback that auditors receive when preparing and discussing their opinions and their ratings and their audit ratings. But that pressure is not only coming from the auditee, it's also coming from inside internal audit, when the chief audit executive or one of the MT members feels that it should not be overly negative or too critical. And then that leads to a disproportionate challenge to the auditor. And that's maybe the example of Nicolas. So I think internal auditors should always challenge themselves and receive the proportionate challenges from everybody as a gift. It helps to be in the nuance of what you want to do. But if the conclusion or the rating cannot be positive anymore, it just needs to be negative. And the auditor should never change it. So I think the chief audit executive has a very important role. He should stay strong for his people and always defend what they need to do. And then also, depending on how mature the company is, how mature management is and the audit committee is, they will always see the long-term value of this positioning and staying strong. And then your question, so what if that's not the case? Well, in the book of Edgar Karsing, he proposes every auditor to have fuck you money. If the situation is not right, make sure you can go out.
Nicolas, new in the standards is that internal auditors must exercise professional skepticism when planning and performing internal audit services. Yeah, I understood that you were skeptical at some points in your career, but what does this mean in practice?
This is a very important one, and it's something I always stress with my staff, especially the new one. And I want the listeners to really listen to me now for a moment. I would summarize it as that: do not take anything for granted. Now, that does not mean that you have to become paranoid and doubt everything. You have to find the right balance. But we know that whether you are providing a document, an information, a response in an interview, it might be incomplete, it might be incorrect, and it might be incorrect because it's a mistake, or it can be incorrect willfully if someone wants to hide something, for example, a case of fraud. You have also experience that plays a part, and whether you are a junior or a more senior one, because if you're a junior auditor, say, you may not know yet when you have to push after receiving some information that, it doesn't add up or it's not sufficient. And if you're an experienced one, that's the opposite. That's the opposite bias. You might be too familiar with the domain and then not think critically. So that's how I see it. It's really, do not take anything for granted. And I think that every kind of supervision that we have, whether it is the engagement supervisor, the chief audit executive, your audit committee, depending on your setup, they have a role to play in challenging you and developing your critical thinking and your skepticism. And again, I will give you one or two examples from my past. I was once asking an internal audit function how often did the audit committee meet? And they told me 4 times a year, which is fine. It looks aligned with best practice. And it says so in the law, in their law, And then I couldn't find any minutes for those audit committees. So I kept on pressing the issue. And then I switched gears and I said, okay, when was the last audit committee meeting? And the answer was 3 years ago. And in their mind, because it was in the law, well, that's what they did. And actually that was not. If I had not been skeptic, I would have said, okay, the law says 4 times a year. It tells me 4 times a year. That's okay. So you have always to push that. Another one, a classical one is you say you're asking for a policy and then they give you a document. Okay, that's fine. But then you realize, that policy is not communicated or is not approved by management. So again, you have always whatever piece of information you get, ask yourself, is that complete? Is that relevant as well? Is that the most up-to-date one? And even if in doubt, you go to your colleague, your supervisor, your chief audit executive.
I would like to add maybe there that it's also important to have some awareness of your personal biases there. The longer you work in an organization, the better you know things. And you were already referring a bit to that, Nicolas, that indeed you might think that you know everything and you take it for granted then. As well as the better that you get to know your colleagues or the people working in your organization, the more risk there is as well on personal bias. So that's something that you have to be aware of as an internal auditor as well.
Yeah, John, and I remember a keynote you gave at our conference last time about becoming biased after a long time in internal audit. So I know you have quite a strong opinion on that as well.
Yeah, well, it's not only me who has the strong opinion, but I think every internal audit shop should have a rotation policy. And I've been doing it within Euroclear now last year, and I did it at ABN AMRO when I was there five years ago. After 7 years running the audits for a certain area of the company, you are biased by default. And that's, by the way, also for the chief audit executive. So 7 years would for me be the maximum.
Okay, and Nicolas, you mentioned in one of your first examples that you wanted information, they didn't give it to you for a good reason. That brings me to one of the next topics in the standard, which is protection of information, which is now also included in the standards. So given the increasing complexity of data protection, increased phishing attacks, the rise of AI, challenges in this field are greater than ever. Historically, internal auditors had access to all information within their company. Should internal auditors nowadays still have access to everything, or should it be limited?
Yeah, the environment is changing. I will give a short answer and I will develop a longer one. The short answer is yes, but I do strongly believe that internal audit should have access to all necessary information to perform their work. And ideally, it would be inscribed or enshrined in the internal audit charter. But because the environment has changed, the complexity, the way we record data, the way you can steal data or lose data, I think it should be on a need-to-know basis. So that means that if, as an internal auditor, I need information to perform an audit, I should have access to it. Do I need to have access to all information about the whole organization at any point in time? Yeah, maybe not. Also, access for a period of time. Not a permanent access. You can request access and it should be granted to you. If not, again, you can go to your chief audit executive. But having a permanent access to everything you have ever done in internal audit, I don't think that that's a good idea. And of course, using adequate data protection measure, whether it is encryption, record keeping, anonymization or pseudonymization when it's needed, especially when we talk about personal data, salaries and stuff like that. I would advise to, again, when in doubt, consult with your chief audit executive, with legal of compliance, because there are some legal and compliance aspect in there. Of course, there was also the new technology that plays a role now. We had a talk yesterday at the office about the use of AI, for example. What kind of data can we put in a tool like ChatGPT? Can we? And then what kind of data can we? Coming back on my answer, on a need-to-know basis, I'll give you an example. I was once performing an audit on compensation and benefits. I had access to that and my junior auditor. The other members of my staff had not access because they were not performing the audit and it's not relevant for them in the performance of their engagement. So that's the need-to-know basis. For a given period of time, well, I would ask access to, say, the SharePoint of a business to perform an audit. For the period of that audit, I don't need that access 3 years later. And using adequate protection, data protection, that has to be determined by your chief audit executives. And depending on the sensitivity of the data, you have to have more stringent protection measures. So coming on the question, it's a resounding yes, but we have to take into account the evolving environment, and we have also to comply with laws and regulation.
I think it's a very interesting analysis. But I would think that we need to be hard on the principle. We have the right to access to everything, and then maybe be flexible in the way we do it. And of course, protect the sensitive information as much as we can.
I fully agree with that as well, that it's probably better on a need-to-know basis, because that's also in the interest of the internal auditor. There's a lot of data out there, a lot of sensitive data, and the regulation on data protection becomes more and more complex, which means also that there is an increased risk for the internal auditor. So I definitely think that it makes sense to have it, like, for instance, on a need-to-know basis and temporary accesses only.
But then the auditor is to say what is need-to-know, right? Not the auditee.
Yes, definitely internal audit, yes.
And then maybe competencies are key. John, the responsibility for internal auditors is to continuously develop their competencies. For auditors, for professional certifications, the rules are quite clear on an annual number of CPEs and so on. They're less strict for internal auditors without a professional certification. Why is continuous education so important, and how can or how should it be achieved?
Well, I think a sufficient skilled staff is the only thing you have. That's the way to quality auditing. And that means that I think that we all should strive to have as much as possible certified staff. And CIA, of course, is the major one in that. But apart from that, even people that have more business knowledge coming into your division, they should also be trained on basic audit principles. But after that, I think it's for all the same. If you look at the speed of risk that we are working in, it needs continuous education all the time. And I did my CPA training in 1988 and my CIA in 2001. Just think about that I wouldn't do continuous education after that. With data science, culture and behavioral auditing and all these new things coming in, we need continuous education. And I think that's also very easy to get. IIA is offering so much in this respect. And soon the ECIA will even start offering a full library of trainings offered in Europe. So I think it's very easy for auditors to find training.
And to add up on that, in the considerations now in the standards, there's a lot of references to good practices, not only in following training, but there's also the broader spectrum of self-study on the job training. On the job training is a very important one as well. And stimulating rotation, because by rotating, it also increases your knowledge, in particular when it comes to the business knowledge.
I totally agree, but it was one point I was slightly disappointed about the new standards compared to the draft version. It was in the draft, the inclusion of the 20, I believe, mandatory requirements, mandatory CPEs for non-certified internal auditors. It has been dropped. I understand why, and I know that in some region of the world, it's very difficult to get training or budget for training. But it's 20 CPEs, which means it's 3 days, 3 times 7 hours. It's not that much. So for the auditors listening, or the chief audit executive, make it a KPI. Make sure that every single of your staff have at least 3 days of training a year. It's not that much. And if you don't have the budget for that, which I can understand, it's another issue. And then you have to take that up with, depending on your organization, your audit committee, top management, or the board. But I would strongly advise you can go beyond the standards. They don't make it mandatory. Make it in your function that every single internal auditor follows at least 3 days of training on a year basis.
And to clarify or give some insights on the reason why it dropped, actually, is that there was a lot of discussion, and it was probably in the comments as well, the most one where we saw the most discrepancy between more or less, because the CPEs for certified internal auditors is a minimum of 40. So including now 20 would mean that your non-certified internal auditors would only have to go for 20 CPEs, whilst the certified one, who has already proven that he knows everything about the standards, has to go for 40 a year. So it's a very difficult discussion. So we went to our certification board, and they advised us not to include absolute numbers there, because that policy might also change over time. So this would then also require a change in the standards. So that's why they are not anymore in absolute numbers there, but there are indeed a lot of references, and even in the requirement, it states clearly that you have to have and you have to provide for your training for your internal auditors.
Yeah, but maybe on a moral note, I would hope that there's no chief audit executive that makes this distinction within his division. I mean, if you provide training to your staff, it should be the same for all.
I agree.
Me too.
Who am I to say no? So I couldn't agree more with that. Any final thoughts on the domain of ethics and professionalism?
I want to repeat the fact that if you're not in the right situation and you cannot make your point in the job that you have, get out of it.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this episode. If I may share some conclusions. Continuous education is key. Access to information should be on a need-to-know basis, but we should still have access to everything, but limited in time. Internal auditors should remain skeptical, but definitely not become paranoid. And in the end, we all need some fuck you money. So thank you everyone for being here today. So thanks a lot, Kathleen, John, and Nicolas. And if you want to know more about this topic, you can go to iaabelgium.org or theiaa.org to stay tuned for the latest news around this topic. Thank you very much.